They said it was for the best. But how would you feel if your own mother called to say, "Don't come to your sister's wedding. Your construction job would embarrass the family"? I didn't argue. I didn't explain that construction meant a billion-dollar green tech company called Green Forge Industries. 2 days later, while they toasted perfection under chandeliers, I helped build. The groom looked at me and said, "Are you the CEO of Green Forge?" The whole room froze. And that's when silence finally spoke for me. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Portland, Oregon, April 2025. The afternoon light fell through the wide kitchen window, fractured and soft, the kind of gray glow that only existed in Oregon when spring hadn't decided if it wanted to stay. I was bent over my laptop reviewing a design layout for our new solar composite panels when my phone buzzed across the counter. The screen lit up Mom. I stared at it for a second. We hadn't really talked since Christmas, and even then it was polite, careful. I took a slow breath and answered, "Hey, Mom." Her voice was syrupy at first, the way it always got when she had something unpleasant to deliver. "Emily, sweetheart. I just wanted to check in about next weekend, Madison's wedding. It's going to be quite elegant. There'll be the Wellington's investors people from Ethan's company." She paused. "I just think maybe you should sit this one out. You know how people can be about construction work? They don't always understand." I kept my eyes on the computer screen. The cursor blinked over the words, Green Forge Industries, Sustainable Futures. I could feel the muscles in my jaw tighten. "So you don't want me there," I said softly. "I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable," she said quickly. Defensive, but pretending not to be. "You've always been so independent, and Madison's big day is about her." Behind her, I heard the familiar, low rumble of my father's voice. "Linda's right, Em. It's not personal." That last line did it. The way he used my name clipped and distant, like he was talking to an employee, not his daughter. I looked down at my hands, the faint calluses that hadn't left even after years in boardrooms instead of job sites. "I understand," I said, steady and flat. Good Mom sighed with relief. "I knew you would. You've always been the reasonable one." Reasonable. The word stung. After I hung up, the kitchen was too quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The neighbor's lawnmower droned somewhere in the distance. I let my hands fall to the counter, palms open. For a second, I was 15 again, standing in our backyard, holding a hammer that felt too heavy for my arms. Dad had been digging out a foundation for the patio. I wanted to help. Mom had leaned out the back door, shaking her head. "Girls don't need to do that, Em. You'll ruin your hands." That same day, I'd hidden in the garage and built a tiny stool out of scrap wood. It was crooked ugly, but I'd never been prouder of anything in my life. I snapped back to the present. My laptop chimed. A new email from our legal department. Subject line, Wellington Group Partnership. Final signatures complete. I clicked it open. The contract value flashed across the screen, $200 million. I scrolled down and saw the project name. Wellington Eco Park Development. I froze, then let out a small laugh that caught in my throat. Of course. Madison's wedding was at the Wellington Resort, part of their eco initiative. The one my company, my embarrassing construction job, was literally building from the ground up. The irony was almost cinematic. I stood up, walked to the window. Outside across the small parking lot, the afternoon light caught the edge of the massive green banner hanging on our headquarters across the street. Green Forge Industries. It read in clean white letters, the leaf-shaped logo swaying in the wind. For a moment, I just watched it move, breathing in that mix of pride and quiet ache that always came when I thought about my family. "They think my work makes them look small," I whispered to the empty room. "But they have no idea how much of their world is built by hands like mine." The phone buzzed again. Sarah, my COO, texting a reminder about our upcoming meeting with the Wellington engineering team. I typed back, "Confirmed. Let's make it perfect." Then I set the phone down, took one last look at the banner, and turned off the kitchen light. The room went dim, but the reflection of the logo still glowed faintly against the window pane. Steady, unshaken. I thought about Mom's voice, the careful way she said, "Sit this one out," as if I was the family's dirty little secret. I exhaled slowly. "They can have their perfect picture," I murmured. "I'll build something real." Outside, the sky had started to drizzle, and the sound of rain against glass was soft, but insistent. I stayed there for a while, listening, letting it fill the silence they'd left behind. The next morning, Seattle woke up wrapped in mist. The city always looked softer that way, gray glass buildings half hidden behind the fog cranes rising from the port like steel skeletons. From the top floor of the Green Forge headquarters, I could see cargo ships crawling across the water, their horns echoing faintly. Sarah Nguyen pushed open the conference room door, a coffee in each hand. "Triple shot for you," she said. "You're going to need it. The Wellington Eco Park site update just came in." "Thanks," I said, taking the cup. "Let's see what they've got." She spread out blueprints on the glass table, the city skyline reflecting over the ink. Phase 2. "Foundation is complete," she said. "We're ahead of schedule." The board's ecstatic. I scanned the drawings tracing the familiar curves of the design. Solar panels built into the roofline water recycling units tucked behind garden terraces. "Good," I murmured. "That project has to speak for itself." Sarah hesitated for a beat, glancing at me over the rim of her cup. "You know what's funny," she said finally. "Your mom's banning you from the wedding, and yet the venue she's so proud of wouldn't exist without Greenforge, without you." I looked up from the plans meeting her eyes. There was sympathy there, but also something sharper, disbelief maybe. I gave a small shrug. "Let them think I don't belong. The truth has better timing than I do." She smiled faintly. "You always say that like it's a law of physics. It usually is." I said, leaning back. "Eventually, everything built on lies collapses under its own weight." Through the glass wall, a group of junior engineers was gathered around a model of a housing prototype. Their voices carried faintly excited, messy, passionate. I watched them for a moment, their hands moving over blueprints and laptops, the smell of solder faint in the air. I remembered standing on a job site 15 years ago. My palms blistered under welding gloves, grease streaking across my jeans, but feeling completely alive. That was before the suits, before the board meetings, before I learned that respect was often reserved for people who looked the part, not those who did the work. Sarah noticed me drifting. "You okay?" I nodded, just remembering how this all started. "We used to measure success in inches of welded seams, not in stock valuations." She smirked. "And yet, look at you now, our CEO. The same people who said you'd never make it would probably quote your press releases if it helped their PR." I let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe, but they still wouldn't invite me to dinner." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence built from mutual understanding. A sharp ping broke it. Sarah's phone vibrated. "Oh," she said, scrolling. "Guess who just updated their wedding website? Let me guess." I said dry. "My family." She nodded, holding out the phone. The site gleamed with pale gold text and smiling photos. Madison Carter and Ethan Wellington, a celebration of elegance and legacy. Below that, the location, Wellington Eco Park Resort. Seattle. My eyes lingered on the tagline, a union of two distinguished families shaping a sustainable future together. I exhaled slowly through my nose. "Distinguished families," I repeated. "That's one way to spell hypocrisy." Sarah frowned. "It's messed up, Em. You built half that resort. The solar integration system, the recycled concrete. Greenforge literally made the place sustainable. They're using your name in the marketing materials and pretending it's a coincidence." "It's not messed up," I said, voice even. "It's predictable." I reached for my tablet and opened the project overview file. The first page bore the Wellington Group's signature crest. Partnership with Greenforge Industries. The irony was enough to make me smile. Sarah hesitated again, then pulled another file from her bag. "There's something else." I raised an eyebrow. "That tone sounds expensive." "It's the guest list for the wedding," she said, sliding it across the table. I didn't hack it. Ethan's assistant sent it over by accident when we were syncing event logistics. "Take a look." I skimmed the document. Rows of names in elegant serif font. Corporate head senators, a few high-profile philanthropists. Near the top, Charles Wellington, Chairman Wellington Group. Right below it, Ethan Wellington, groom. I paused, reading the name again. "Charles Wellington," I said slowly. "He's the one who signed the partnership with us." Sarah nodded. "And his son, apparently, is the one marrying your sister." The connection clicked in my head like a perfectly aligned joint. So the Wellingtons, the same family trying to expand their green image through our technology, are marrying into the Carters, No wonder Mom's suddenly obsessed with appearances. Sarah leaned forward. Do they even know you're their new partner? Not yet, I said, but they will. The line between business and family had never felt thinner, sharper, or more dangerous. For a while, we both stared at the plans on the table. The morning fog outside was starting to lift, and light spilled across the conference room, glinting off the chrome edges of the model. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. What are you going to do? I traced a finger along the edge of the blueprint, the recycled material specs, the clean geometry of the design. Nothing, I said. Not yet. Her brow furrowed. You're really just going to let them? I'm going to let the truth do its job, I said, looking up at her. They'll see soon enough who really belongs in that room. Sarah tilted her head. Doesn't it hurt, though, to be cut out of your own family's picture? I smiled faintly. Hurt maybe once. Now it just feels like proof. She didn't press further. Instead, she gathered the blueprints, stacked them neatly, and said quietly, Justice has good timing. Always, I said. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Down below, I could see the engineers starting to pack up for the morning site visit, laughter echoing faintly through the glass. I looked out toward the harbor, ships moving slowly through the fog, carrying tons of steel stone and raw potential. For a long moment, I just stood there watching the water, feeling the familiar calm of inevitability. Sarah's voice broke the silence. Hey, she said, hesitating at the door. You ever wish it had been different? That they'd just been proud of you from the start? I turned from the window, met her gaze, and smiled. No, I said quietly. If they had, I might never have built anything worth proving. She nodded. Slipping out of the room, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. I stayed where I was, the city stretching before me, gray, imperfect, alive. The kind of place that understood people like me, the ones they didn't see coming until it was too late. By noon, the hum of machines downstairs had faded into a steady rhythm, the kind that only came from a factory in sync with itself. I was reviewing the latest batch report when my assistant buzzed through the intercom. Emily, there's a Mr. Carter here to see you. For a second, I thought she'd said it wrong. Mr. Carter, I repeated. Yes, ma'am. He says he's your father. I stared at the intercom, then pressed the button. Send him up. My father had never set foot in Greenforge before. Not once in 9 years. When the elevator doors opened, he stepped out in a beige windbreaker, looking slightly lost in the sea of glass and steel. Wow, he said, glancing around. You've built quite a place here. I have, I said, forcing a smile. Want a tour? He nodded, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets. Sure, if you have time. I led him down the hall toward the manufacturing wing. Through the wide windows, rows of automated mixers were turning recycled glass and limestone dust into our proprietary bioconcrete, a material that could absorb carbon dioxide as it cured. The air smelled faintly of cement and ozone. This is where the magic happens, I said, keeping my tone professional like I was talking to an investor instead of my father. We've been developing this compound for 5 years. Stronger than traditional concrete, completely sustainable. He nodded slowly, clearly impressed, but trying not to show it. It's very modern. It's the future, I corrected. Or at least that's what we're betting on. He lingered by the glass, watching the workers in hard hats load panels onto a conveyor. You always did like building things, he said quietly. Even when you were a kid, I let out a small laugh. Mom didn't think so. That brought the conversation exactly where I expected it to go. He cleared his throat. Your mother she worries what people think, that's all. You know how she is. I do. I said, she's always been afraid of the wrong thing. He looked at me confused. What do you mean she's afraid of looking bad? I said, keeping my voice steady. I'm afraid of being fake. He didn't respond. His eyes drifted back to the production floor, the reflection of machines flickering across his face. I could feel the old frustration rise. Years of it. The arguments about college. The nights when Mom said I was wasting my potential, and he just sat there staring into his coffee. Voiceover in my head, the one that always came when silence stretched too long. Your father's silence used to feel like safety. Then it started to feel like permission. We stood there for a while, both pretending to admire the machinery. Finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. Your mother asked me to bring this, he said, handing it to me. It's your invitation. I took it. The front read, in embossed gold script, The Carter family too. I raised an eyebrow. Too. He shifted, uneasy. It's just how the planner formatted it. Right, I said, tucking it into my folder without opening it. His face tightened, but he didn't argue. You know, Em, your mother means well. She's just scared, I finished for him. I know. He nodded, relieved I'd said it so he didn't have to. Exactly. She's scared. The elevator dinged behind us. Someone from logistics bringing in new samples. The spell broke. Well, he said, glancing at his watch, I should get going. I just wanted to see the place for myself. I'm glad you did. I said, though part of me wasn't sure if I meant it. He smiled, awkward and soft. You've done well, Emily. Really. Your grandfather would be proud. Thank you, I said. When he left, the room felt heavier. His voice still echoed faintly in the glass walls, that mix of pride and distance that had always defined our conversations. I walked back to my office. The afternoon sun had shifted. Light streaked across the desk, warm but sharp. The invitation sat there like a dare. My phone rang. Henry Collins's name flashed across the screen. I answered. Emily, he said, brisk and calm. We're doing a compliance sweep on the Wellington contract per your request. There's an integrity clause tied to the agreement. Standard procedure, but I wanted your sign-off before we dig into personal affiliations. Define personal affiliations, I said, sitting down. Any relationship between your company and theirs that could present a conflict of interest. He said, board members, family ties, public appearances, anything that might raise questions. I stared at the invitation on my desk. Go ahead, I said. Run it thoroughly. Will do, Henry replied. We'll flag anything noteworthy. I hesitated, then added. And Henry, make sure it's airtight. I have a feeling this one's going to get complicated. He chuckled softly. Aren't they all? When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair. The city buzzed faintly outside. The sound of Crane's traffic construction life continuing in its noisy, indifferent way. I picked up the invitation again, turning it over in my hands. The Carter family, too. Not 3. Not including me. A small smile tugged at my mouth, the kind that came from irony too sharp to ignore. Through the window, the mirrored towers of downtown Seattle caught my reflection, small, pale, framed by steel and sky. I've become someone they can't introduce, I whispered. For once, the thought didn't sting. It just felt true. 3 nights later, the apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of my laptop. The glow from the screen cast thin shadows across the kitchen table, outlining the half-finished mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I'd been working through the latest project update when the soft ping of an incoming email broke the silence. The subject line read, "For the good of the family." I didn't have to open it to know who it was from. I clicked anyway. The message was short. Too polished to be spontaneous, too polite to be kind. Emily. Please for once don't make things harder. Madison's wedding is meant to be perfect. You being there will only confuse people. Let's not create tension where there doesn't need to be any. I'm asking you as your mother to let this day be about your sister. You'll understand someday. Love, Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the words pulsing under the faint blue light. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. There was a time when I would have written back a long message, defending myself, pleading to be understood. But that version of me had disappeared somewhere between late nights at construction sites and boardroom negotiations. I typed 2 words instead. I understand. Then I hit send and deleted the email thread entirely. The soft click of the delete key echoed louder than it should have. For a few seconds, I just sat there, my hands still on the keyboard. The city lights flickered beyond the window, blurred through the drizzle that had started again. My voice in my head, steady but tired. I used to think silence was weakness. Now I know it's what you use to protect what's left of your dignity when words mean nothing. The apartment door opened behind me. Sarah's voice cut through the quiet. You're still working. I turned in my chair as she stepped inside, shrugging off her raincoat, her dark hair damp from the Seattle mist. Couldn't sleep, I said. She noticed the expression on my face and frowned. Email from your mom. I nodded. Same speech, new format. She really told you not to come. She told me to make her life easier. Sarah crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. So, are you going? I closed the laptop halfway, the light dimming across the room, not as the daughter they're ashamed of. I said quietly, if I go, it'll be as the person they owe an apology to. Her eyebrows rose. That sounds like a maybe. I didn't answer. Instead, I reopened my laptop and pulled up the Wellington contract file. Rows of attachments scrolled down the screen: permits, engineering schematics, payment schedules. One caught my eye. Strategic partnership announcement. Event coordination. I clicked it open. The date matched the wedding day. Same time, same venue. I sat back in my chair reading it again just to be sure. The document listed both Wellington Group and Greenforge Industries as key collaborators to be recognized during a private ceremony at the Wellington estate. A quiet laugh escaped me, low and disbelieving. Of course, I murmured. Sarah stepped closer, peering at the screen. You're kidding. They're announcing the partnership during the wedding. I nodded slowly. Apparently, they thought it'd make for good press. So you're technically invited, she said, smirking. I turned to her. Legally speaking, yes. Professionally speaking, I might even be the guest of honor. Sarah grinned. God, that's poetic. It's convenient, I said. They get their perfect family portrait, and I get to stand in the background as the foundation holding it all up. For a moment, the two of us were silent, the absurdity of it settling between us. Outside thunder rolled faintly over the sound. Sarah said finally, if you show up, they'll lose their minds. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair. Arms crossed. Then maybe it's time they see what sanity looks like. She tilted her head, studying me. You've been calm about this. Too calm. You sure you're not angry I was? I admitted, for a long time, but anger takes energy. I'd rather use mine to build something they can't ignore. She exhaled slowly. What if they see you there and try to throw you out? I smiled. Then they'll be throwing out their business partner in front of the people funding their expansion. Her laugh was quick and nervous. You always were terrifying when you're polite. I stood, moving to the window. The rain had stopped, and the reflection of the skyline shimmered across the glass. Down below, Greenforge's logo glowed faintly from the side of the building. White letters against green light. They wanted perfection, I said softly. They're about to get it. Sarah watched me for a moment before asking, what are you planning exactly? Nothing. I said, not yet. I'll just show up where I'm supposed to be. The hum of the city filled the quiet that followed. The sound of traffic, a distant ferry horn, the steady pulse of something inevitable. Sarah picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. You should try to get some sleep. You'll need it. I nodded, but I didn't move. When she reached the door, she paused. If they see you, your mom, your sister, what are you going to do? I turned from the window, my reflection catching the light. When the truth knocks, I said, I'm not going to hide. She held my gaze for a second, then nodded. Fair enough. After she left, the apartment felt even quieter. I shut down the laptop, the room falling into darkness, except for the streetlights outside. My own reflection looked back at me in the window. Calm, resolute, a stranger to the girl who used to need permission to be proud of herself. The rain started again, soft and steady, tapping against the glass. Like the faintest of reminders, some storms you don't run from. You walk right through them. The legal department always smelled like paper and old coffee, proof that some parts of business would never go digital, no matter how modern we became. I walked in to find Henry Collins standing by the conference table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. His team of associates had spread out files across every available surface. He looked up when I entered. Emily, he said, motioning for me to join him. We found something unusual during the Wellington verification process. I set my tablet down. Define unusual. He flipped open a folder and slid a document toward me. This came up while we were confirming affiliate profiles for the partnership announcement. One of the external marketing consultants listed under the Wellington Foundation's roster, Madison Carter. My sister's name looked wrong on paper. I glanced up. Go on. She submitted documentation listing an MBA from Columbia University. He paused, tapping the file. We contacted the school for standard verification. They have no record of a Madison Carter ever attending, let alone graduating. I stared at the document, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, not surprise, just that slow, resigned pulse that came whenever family and truth collided. Henry hesitated. I thought you should know before this becomes a potential compliance issue. The integrity clause gives us grounds to withdraw from the contract if there's any proven fraud connected to an affiliated family member. I drummed my fingers lightly against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She learned how to live behind a mask, I said finally. The lawyers exchanged uncertain glances. Henry watched me carefully. I leaned back, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights filling the space between words. Madison always believed that if she lied long enough, the truth would get tired and leave. The memory hit without warning. Another dinner, another performance. Madison at 22, freshly back from a semester abroad, wearing her first designer dress and announcing her acceptance into Columbia's MBA program. My mother had cried then. Proud tears that reflected the glow of the chandelier. My father had raised a glass. I'd said nothing. Just passed the mashed potatoes. Emily Henry's voice brought me back. Sorry, I said, just thinking how consistent she is. Sarah, who'd slipped in quietly, halfway through the meeting, spoke up. Do you want us to do anything about it? We can request a formal report, send it to Wellington Group. No, I said. Not yet, she frowned. You're not going to expose her. I'm not in the business of exposure, I said. But if anyone asks, we'll answer honestly. I'm done cleaning up other people's lies. Henry nodded, though he didn't look entirely comfortable. Fair enough. But you understand the clause means. I know what it means. I interrupted gently. It was designed for situations exactly like this. He studied me for a moment, then smiled faintly. You drafted half of that clause yourself. I did. I said, allowing the corner of my mouth to lift. Back when I still thought integrity could be written into contracts, one of his associates approached with a printout tentative. Ms. Carter. Here's the official confirmation from Columbia's registrar. You'll want to keep this on file. The paper was warm from the printer, the ink still smelling faintly of toner. I read the line again, no record found. The simplicity of it almost made me laugh. Sarah broke the silence. Do you think Madison even remembers what's true anymore? I looked at her, then back at the letter. She doesn't have to. Mom remembers for her. Henry cleared his throat. So, what do you want us to do with this information? I stood, smoothing the paper flat on the table. Make 3 certified copies. 1 for legal, 1 for me, 1 for Wellington's compliance office. He raised an eyebrow. You plan to hand it over? Not yet, I said, but I want it ready. Some truths shouldn't have to wait for permission. Sarah exhaled quietly, the sound almost a whistle. You think this will come up at the event? Eventually, I said. It always does. Henry gestured to his team to start preparing the documents. I'll have the copies sealed by the end of the day. Do you want me to add the integrity clause reference to the packet? Yes, I said. Full text highlighted section and note the date it was last reviewed. If this clause ever had a purpose, it's about to find it. Sarah followed me out into the hallway after the meeting. The corridors of Greenforge always felt a little too pristine. White walls, glass doors, sunlight bouncing off everything. She walked beside me silent until we reached the elevator. You know, she said quietly, this could blow up in a big way. I know, I said. Madison's not just your sister. If this goes public, your mom, your family, will finally see the difference between pride and integrity, I finished. The elevator doors opened, and we stepped inside. The floor numbers blinked down slowly as we descended to the main lobby. Sarah looked at me sideways. So what's the plan then? I met her eyes. We don't need a plan. We just need to tell the truth when the time comes. Her mouth curved into a half smile. You make it sound easy. It's not, I said, but it's simple. When we reached the lobby, I walked straight to my office. My desk was clean, the afternoon light spilling across the wood. Henry's assistant had already placed a folder there, a slim blue one embossed with the Greenforge logo. Inside were the 3 certified documents, the integrity clause, the registrar's statement from Columbia, and Henry's cover memo. I ran my fingertips over the folder, feeling the faint ridge of the embossed lettering. It was the kind of blue that caught the light differently depending on how you tilted it, sometimes soft, sometimes steel. I closed it, slid it into my briefcase, and latched the clasp with a quiet click. The reflection in the office glass caught my eyes, steady, calm, sharper than it used to be. Somewhere downstairs a forklift beeped, the sound echoing faintly through the concrete. Life moved on. And above it all, my voice low but certain. Some truths are born waiting for the right moment to be seen. I picked up the briefcase and walked out, the echo of my heels following me down the hall. The blue folder secure in my hand like a promise waiting to be kept. Rain had been falling since morning, thin and steady, the kind that turned Seattle gray, but never quite dark. I was sitting on the couch, laptop open, when my phone lit up across the table. The name on the screen froze me mid-breath. Mom. I stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer, then swiped. "Hi, Mom." Her voice came through tense and clipped the way it did when she was pretending not to panic. "Emily, listen, I just got off a call with the wedding planner. There's been a lot of talk about the guest list, and please don't make this harder. The Wellington family has a reputation, and you showing up, it would make me look bad. It would make all of us look bad." I stood walking toward the window. The city below was a blur of headlights and umbrellas. "Mom?" "I'm not planning to make anyone look bad," I said, keeping my tone even. "I'm not going as your daughter. I'm going because of work." There was a pause. "What do you mean, work?" "Greenforge is part of the Wellington Eco Park development," I said. "The same property where the wedding's taking place. Our materials, our systems, our people. If anyone asks, you can tell them your daughter's the CEO who made the building possible." Silence stretched on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her breath tighten. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. "You're always so stubborn, and you're always so scared of what people think," I said softly. The air between us grew heavy. I could picture her sitting at her kitchen table in Portland, clutching her coffee mug like a shield. "Emily," she said. Finally, voice trembling. "This is your sister's wedding. Can't you just let her have her moment?" "I have no intention of taking it away from her," I said. "But I'm not going to hide from it either." She sighed, the sound sharp and tired. "You always have to prove something." "Not this time," I said. "This time, I'll just be there." She didn't respond. The line went dead a moment later. I stood there, phone still in my hand, the low hum of rain filling the room. My reflection in the window looked back at me, expression unreadable. I set the phone down and took a deep breath. 2 days. That's all that was left. 2 days before the wedding, that was never meant to include me. By the next morning, the rain had eased into a drizzle. I drove out to the Greenforge distribution center to check on the final shipment headed for the Wellington estate. The place smelled of steel and sawdust, the kind of smell that always made me feel grounded. Workers loaded pallets of solar composite panels onto the back of a flatbed truck, wrapping them in waterproof tarps stamped with our logo. The foreman spotted me and waved. "We're making the last delivery today, Ms. Carter. They'll have the signage installed by afternoon." "Good," I said. "Make sure the placement's clear. The Wellington team wants visibility for the brand." He grinned. "They'll get it. You'll be able to see it from the main drive." By the time I got back to the city, the roads shimmered with puddles reflecting traffic lights. My phone buzzed as I parked. Sarah. She'd sent a picture, a crew of workers in rain jackets standing under a half-finished archway at the Wellington estate, mounting a polished silver plaque into place. The engraved words gleamed under the overcast sky. "Powered by Greenforge Sustainable Materials." Below the photo, her message. "It's up. Everyone walking in will see it." A small smile tugged at my mouth. I typed back, "Good. They wanted perfection. Let's make sure the truth stands right next to it." That afternoon, I stayed at the office longer than usual, reviewing updates for the contract and pretending it was just another day. But the truth pressed at the back of my mind like a pulse. The irony of it all. The family desperate to look successful, holding their grand event inside a structure built by the daughter they'd disowned. As the sun set, I opened the Wellington project file one last time. A rendering of the estate filled the screen. Sleek, modern, lined with glass and steel, every inch supported by Greenforge's systems. I zoomed in on the main entrance where the new plaque hung. Even in the digital mock-up, it was visible, clean white lettering against brushed silver. I whispered under my breath, "I don't need an invitation. My name's already on every wall." The sound of my own voice startled me. I closed the laptop, letting the darkness of the room settle around me. Across town, I knew Madison was probably surrounded by stylists and champagne trying on the custom gown Mom had bragged about for months. Somewhere, Mom was smoothing a tablecloth, rehearsing small talk for people she desperately wanted to impress. And me. I was sitting in an empty apartment, listening to rain hit the glass. Planning to attend a wedding that wasn't mine to attend, at least not in the way they imagined. The next morning, Sarah called from the construction site. "You're not going to believe this," she said, laughter in her voice. "Ethan Wellington just arrived at the resort for the rehearsal. Guess what's hanging right above the front gate?" "The Greenforge plaque," I said. "Yep." He looked right at it, confused as hell, probably wondering why he's never heard your name before. I could almost picture it. Ethan standing under the archway, polished shoes splattered with rain, glancing up at the silver sign that carried the name of the woman he'd been told was just the blue-collar sister. Keep an eye on things, I said. Always do. Sarah replied, See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, I confirmed. That night, the city was quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and shining. I stood by the window again, the same spot I always ended up when the world felt like it was about to change. The reflection staring back wasn't angry anymore, just steady, focused. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn sounded over the bay. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and said softly, They built their picture-perfect world. I built the foundation under it. The city lights flickered in my eyes like the start of a fire that had been waiting a long time to burn. The morning of the wedding broke clear and bright over Lake Washington, the kind of blue sky people paid photographers to capture. Helicopters circled above the water, delivering VIP guests to the Wellington estate. Down the long private drive, Bentleys and Rolls-Royces gleamed like a moving necklace of chrome and sunlight. I stood in the back seat of my silver Tesla as we turned through the main gate, Sarah beside me, her tablet balanced on her lap. They built this spectacle to prove their worth. I only need to stand still and let mine speak for itself. The estate unfolded in front of us, a sprawling glass and stone masterpiece overlooking the lake, surrounded by manicured lawns and floral arrangements that probably cost more than my first apartment. Every surface shimmered with polished perfection. I recognized the material in the walls. Our carbon-neutral composite, the pride of Greenforge's innovation team. It was strange to see my work dressed up for someone else's fantasy. We pulled up near the main entrance. 2 attendants in black suits stepped forward to open our doors. Good morning, Ms. Carter, one of them said with practiced politeness. Welcome to the Wellington estate. The ceremony begins at 11. Sarah's eyebrows lifted, slightly impressed. They even know your name. They should, I murmured, stepping out. The air smelled like lilies and money. Guests drifted across the courtyard, champagne flutes in hand, voices lilting in soft, polished tones. Photographers moved like shadows, snapping every designer label in sight. As we made our way toward the front steps, I heard my mother's voice. A sharp intake of breath carried over the music. Emily. I turned. Linda stood near the entrance, her hair perfectly set, pearls glinting at her neck. Her face went white. You're not supposed to be here, she hissed, grabbing Madison's arm. I told you she wouldn't come. Madison looked as startled as she did. Mom, I didn't know she would, actually. But before she could finish, Ethan Wellington approached. He cut an elegant figure in his tailored tuxedo expression, curious rather than hostile. Mrs. Carter, is this your daughter? Linda's smile came on too fast, too bright. Oh, yes, but Ethan extended his hand toward me. Emily. Carter, correct CEO of Greenforge Industries. I took his hand, firm but polite. That's right. He nodded slowly. I've heard the name. Greenforge is one of the Wellington Group's key partners on the Eco-Park project, isn't it? Before I could answer, Linda slipped between us like a shield. It's just a small contribution, she said quickly, her voice honeyed with panic. You know, a local supplier. Nothing significant. I smiled, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her sweat. A small project, I said, lightly worth $200 million. Ethan's eyes flickered, confusion shadowed with recognition. 200 million, give or take, I said, still smiling. Sustainability costs money. Wellington. He looked at me for a moment, something calculating behind his expression. Madison's hand clutched his sleeve, her knuckles white. Ethan, we should... He nodded slowly, but didn't move. Of course, he said finally. It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Carter. I'll see you inside. Linda didn't wait for him to walk away before leaning close. What do you think you're doing? She whispered, her voice shaking. You can't just show up and... I was invited, I said softly. You just didn't know it. She blinked, bewildered, and for a moment I saw something almost like fear in her eyes. Madison tugged her mother's arm. Come on, Mom. People are watching. They hurried off toward the main hall, heels clicking against the stone like a retreat. Sarah fell into step beside me, her voice low. You handled that better than I would have. I've had practice, I said. Inside, the San H shimmered with light. The glass walls overlooked the lake where sailboats drifted lazily in the distance. Guests mingled among tables draped in ivory linen. Every centerpiece a small forest of orchids. The soft hum of a string quartet filled the space. As we walked deeper into the lobby, I noticed it. Our logo, Greenforge, displayed on the digital screens flanking the main corridor. Promotional banners described the ecopark's commitment to renewable energy, carbon-neutral materials, and sustainable partnerships. My company's name glowed everywhere. Sarah leaned closer, whispering with a grin. You realize you're in the center of their universe right now, and they have no idea. That's the thing about truth, I said quietly. It doesn't need an invitation. It just needs visibility. We moved past clusters of guests, nodding politely as people glanced curiously in our direction. Most probably assumed I was some corporate liaison. Important, but not important enough to remember. Near the ballroom entrance, a small crowd had gathered. I caught sight of Charles Wellington, the patriarch himself, tall and composed in a midnight suit. He was shaking hands with donors, his presence commanding but gracious. His wife stood nearby, beaming for the cameras, when his gaze swept the room and landed briefly on me. I saw it, the faint flicker of recognition, not personal, just professional. The face of a business partner he'd only met through email and contracts. He gave a polite nod, the kind reserved for equals. My mother noticed. She froze halfway across the hall, lips parting as she realized what she'd just seen. Sarah nudged me. You catch that? Every second, I said. We took our seats at the back of the ballroom, where a panoramic window framed the lake like a painting. I could hear the chatter of guests rising and falling, the laughter of people certain their world was unshakable. They dressed the day in perfection to prove their worth, while the truth stood quietly among them, already part of everything they touched. From where I sat, I could see the grand entrance arch through the glass doors. The silver plaque gleamed in the sun, the one my crew had mounted days before, a partnership for the future. Wellington does Greenforge. Sarah leaned over, whispering with satisfaction. There it is. Every guest walking through that door has to see your name first. I watched as the sunlight hit the metal, the letters flashing white for a heartbeat, before the reflection faded. They wanted a symbol of legacy, I said softly. I gave them one. The string quartet shifted into a new melody, and the officiant's voice called everyone to attention. Guests began finding their seats. From the balcony above, the sound of laughter floated down. Madison's high and bright, the perfect sound for a perfect bride. Sarah reached for her glass of water. You okay? I'm fine, I said, my eyes still on the plaque outside. Because for the first time in years I really was. The ballroom glowed under a canopy of white flowers and chandeliers that caught every bit of light, scattering it like glass rain. The air was heavy with perfume and polished laughter, that particular brand of small talk reserved for people who'd spent their lives being admired. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, with champagne flutes balanced like crystal wands. I sat near the back, Sarah beside me, both of us quiet observers. While they drowned in illusion, I stood quietly inside the truth they refused to see. Charles Wellington took the stage just as the orchestra's music softened. He was an impressive man, tall, silver-haired, the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. He tapped the microphone, and the murmurs faded into silence. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice deep and deliberate. Today is a celebration of two remarkable unions. The first, of course, is the marriage of my son Ethan to the beautiful Madison Carter. Applause rippled through the hall. Madison smiled too brightly, gripping Ethan's arm a little too tightly. My mother dabbed the corner of her eyes with a napkin, playing her part perfectly. Charles continued, his tone warm. But there is another partnership worth recognizing today, one that represents innovation, sustainability, and the future we're all building together. I'm proud to announce that Wellington Group has officially joined forces with Greenforge Industries to pioneer the nation's first carbon-neutral luxury estate right here in Seattle. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then polite applause rose from the crowd. At our table, my mother's hand shot out, gripping my father's. She can't, she whispered under her breath. Robert stared straight ahead. Expression unreadable. Madison's face drained of color. Charles smiled, scanning the crowd. And now to speak about this remarkable achievement. Please welcome the woman behind it. Greenforge's founder and CEO, Ms. Emily Carter. The words hung in the air like static. Forks froze midair. The band stopped. The sound of my name moved through the room like a ripple in still water. I stood, smoothing my jacket. Sarah squeezed my wrist under the table before I stepped forward. "Showtime," she whispered. Every eye followed me as I crossed the marble floor. The microphone gleamed under the stage lights. I could feel Madison's stare like a blade between my shoulder blades. I took the microphone from Charles, smiled politely, and faced the sea of stunned faces. "Thank you, Mr. Wellington," I said. "Greenforge started 9 years ago in a garage smaller than this stage. Back then, we had one goal: to build something that lasts without destroying what we depend on. Today, I'm proud to say we're not just building structures, we're building sustainable cities." The applause started slow, cautious, as if the guests weren't sure whether to look at me or at Madison. Somewhere in the front row, my mother whispered, "Dear God," and I heard the sharp clink of glass as her wine spilled over. Madison shot to her feet. "Emily, stop!" Her voice sliced through the quiet. A few heads turned toward her confused. Ethan looked between us, his brow furrowing. "Wait," he said, voice carrying through the microphone that someone had left on at their table. "You're the CEO of Greenforge Industries, the billion-dollar green tech company." The room inhaled as one. I met his gaze. "Yes," I said. "And Greenforge is the company that built this estate. Every recycled panel, every solar unit, every inch of its so-called perfection." The silence was absolute. Then, like a trigger camera, flashes went off in rapid bursts. The sound was deafening, like thunder made of applause and shock. Reporters at the back of the room scrambled for their phones. Grace Thompson, a journalist from Business Chronicle, lifted her camera and started filming. Charles Wellington laughed once, low and genuine, breaking the tension. He stepped forward and extended his hand. "Well," he said, smiling, "it seems we've been working with brilliance. Ms. Carter, this is an honor." I shook his hand. "Likewise, Mr. Wellington." "Please," he said, gesturing toward the microphone again. "Continue." Behind him, Madison sank back into her seat, her shoulders shaking, face pale, as the flowers above her. I turned back to the crowd, my voice calm. "Partnerships like this matter because they remind us that progress doesn't come from legacy. It comes from innovation, from people willing to build with both hands and conviction. Greenforge is proud to stand beside Wellington Group in creating something real, something honest." More flashes, more whispers. Someone clapped again, and this time, others followed. The applause swelled genuine now, even enthusiastic. I caught Sarah's eye from across the room. She mouthed, "Perfect." Charles leaned in. "We'll have to talk later," he said quietly. "There's much I'd like to discuss." "Of course," I replied. When I stepped off the stage, Ethan was still staring at me, 1,000 questions flickering behind his eyes. Madison grabbed his hand, her nails digging into his skin. "She's just showing off," she whispered, desperate. He didn't answer. His gaze didn't leave mine as I walked past. For the first time all day, my mother didn't look at me with anger. She looked at me with something worse, fear. As I passed their table, she whispered hoarsely, "What have you done?" I paused just long enough for her to hear me. Exactly what I was invited to do. Then I kept walking. Behind me, the orchestra began to play again, trying to drag the room back into its pretense of celebration. But the spell was broken. Conversations buzzed in every corner. People whispering my name, connecting dots they hadn't seen before. When I reached my seat, Sarah leaned close. Well, she murmured that went better than expected. I took a sip of water, the crystal glass cool against my lips. "They wanted a perfect story," I said. "Now they've got one." Up front, Madison sat frozen beside Ethan, her face pale and unreadable. Ethan turned to her, whispering something I couldn't hear. She looked down at her hands, shaking her head slowly. From where I sat, I saw the understanding dawn in his eyes, the slow shift from confusion to realization. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at her. And in that quiet, electric moment, I knew something irreversible had begun. The noise started small. A murmur, the rustle of dresses, the clink of glass. And then it spread like fire. Within minutes, the ballroom was alive with whispers, heads turning, cameras raised. Reporters moved fast, sensing blood in the water. Charles Wellington stood at the center of it all, calm, but unreadable. He gestured to one of his assistants who hurried toward the AV booth. The lights dimmed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles said, voice firm over the noise, "before we continue, I'd like to share a short video about our new partner, Green Forge Industries, the company that made this very project possible. The murmuring quieted. The screen behind the stage flickered to life. At first, it was just a shot of scaffolding workers in neon vests, the clatter of machinery. Then the camera panned to me. Hard hat, safety goggles, blueprints rolled under one arm, giving instructions as welding sparks lit up the frame. The image of me in work boots standing in the middle of a dusty construction site filled the entire ballroom. Someone gasped. Another clapped. Then, as the video cut to drone footage of the finished estate, gleaming glass and sunlight, applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling into genuine admiration. I didn't look at Madison, but I felt her eyes burning holes in my back. When the lights came up, she shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "She doesn't represent my family. She's just..." She stopped when she realized how many cameras were aimed at her. Ethan rose slowly beside her, his face tight, holding a printed document in his hand. "Madison," he said evenly, "you told me you earned your MBA from Columbia University." Her breath hitched. "Ethan, please." "I checked," he said louder this time. "There's no record of a Madison Carter. Not under that name. Not under any name." The room fell silent again. The kind of silence that had weight. Madison's lip trembled. I wanted my parents to be proud," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to fit in. The truth doesn't destroy. It only stops the pretending." Charles Wellington stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Wellington Group does not do business with frauds," he said, his tone cutting through the room. "The integrity clause of our contract is clear." His words sent a visible ripple through the guests. The side door opened, and Henry Collins, my lawyer, entered, the blue folder in his hand. He approached the stage with measured steps and handed the documents to Charles. "Verification from Columbia University," Henry said. "Official statement confirming no student by that name ever attended." Linda shot to her feet, voice trembling with outrage. "No, you don't understand my daughter. She's worked so hard for this." Robert gently touched her arm, but said nothing. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. Charles flipped through the pages, each movement deliberate. "This clause," he said, turning toward the crowd, "was designed to protect all parties from reputational harm and deception." He looked up, eyes meeting mine. "Ms. Carter, I assume you were aware of this?" "Yes," I said. "I helped write it." Gasps rippled again. Cameras clicked. The light from the chandeliers glinted off every lens in the room. Ethan stared at Madison, his expression shifting from disbelief to something colder. "You lied to me," he said quietly. "You lied to everyone." She grabbed his wrist. "Ethan, please, I love you." He pulled his hand away. "You love what I represent." His voice was calm, but the microphone still caught it. The crowd heard every word. He reached into his pocket and took out the wedding band that had been waiting for the ceremony. For a moment, he just looked at it. Then he set it down on the table in front of her with a soft metallic sound. "This wedding is over," he said. Madison's knees gave way and she fell back into her chair. The cameras flashed in a frenzy, the air electric with the scent of scandal. Linda covered her mouth, shaking her head. "No, please." I felt Sarah's hand on my shoulder from where she stood near the back. Neither of us said a word. Across the room, Grace Thompson was already speaking into her microphone, her camera aimed at the chaos. "This," she whispered to her producer, "is the story of the year. Get this feed live, now." Charles closed the folder with a sharp snap. "We'll honor our obligations with Greenforge," he said, his voice resonant. "But effective immediately, any personal affiliations tied to fraudulent claims will be terminated." He turned to the crowd. "This event is concluded." The band had stopped playing. The guests began to rise, the buzz of shocked conversation filling the space again. Some looked at me with admiration, others with pity, most with stunned curiosity. Madison sat motionless. Mascara streaked, staring at the ring lying inches from her hand. Linda was beside her, whispering something frantic. Robert stood behind them, his eyes finding mine for the briefest moment. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but he nodded once, slow and almost imperceptible. The sound of clicking heels echoed as people filed toward the exits. I stayed where I was, the air thick with the scent of flowers and champagne gone flat. From the stage, Charles handed the blue folder back to Henry. "Keep this on record," he said quietly. Henry nodded. "Of course, sir." Then he glanced at me as he passed. "Guess the clause worked." "It always does," I said. As the ballroom emptied, Grace approached, camera still rolling. "Ms. Carter," she said, voice careful. "Any comment on what just happened?" I looked into her lens, then past it to where Madison sat with her head in her hands. "Just this," I said quietly. "Some things were never built to last." The flash from her camera lit up the room one last time. By evening, I knew that image. The fallen bride, the ring, the truth, would be everywhere. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to explain a thing. The night air outside the Wellington estate was cold enough to sting. The sky had cleared, but the wind carried a sharp bite off the lake. The laughter, the music, the applause, all of it was gone now, replaced by the low hum of generators and the occasional flash of a reporter's camera still lingering by the gates. Sarah and I walked down the cobblestone path toward the parking lot, the distant lights of Seattle glittering across the water. In my head, the words came clear and quiet, like a truth I'd always known. Karma doesn't need an invitation. It only needs the truth to show up. Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand, lighting up her face in the dark. She stopped walking. "You might want to see this." I leaned over. On her screen, Grace Thompson's video was already viral, 500,000 views in under 2 hours. The headline burned across the top of the feed, bride exposed for fake degree. "Wedding canceled mid-ceremony." Below it, clips from the event looped on repeat, Madison's breakdown. Ethan's voice saying, "This wedding is over." My calm expression beside the Wellington logo. The comments section was chaos, shock, judgment, fascination. Sarah looked at me, shaking her head slowly. "They're calling it the wedding of the year. #IntegrityGate. I almost smiled. The internet moves fast when the story's true. Before she could answer, I heard my name shouted from behind. "Emily." I turned. Linda was hurrying down the walkway, heels sinking into the gravel, hair undone from the wind. Her phone was clutched in one hand like a lifeline. She stopped a few feet away, breathless. "Emily, please, don't leave like this." I said nothing. Her voice cracked. "You have to talk to them. The Wellingtons. They're pulling their social sponsorships, canceling appearances. You don't understand. If they back out our reputation, our connections." "Mom," I said evenly, "you don't have a reputation. You had an illusion." Her eyes widened. "How can you be so cruel?" "Everything we've worked for." "I didn't take anything from you," I interrupted. "You just lost what wasn't real." She shook her head, tears forming. "You don't understand. I've lost everything." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "No, Mom, you lost control. There's a difference." Behind, her headlights swept across the lot. Robert's car pulled up quietly. He got out, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked tired, older than he had that morning. He stopped a few feet away. "Linda," he said softly enough. She spun on him. "Enough. Do you know what's happening? Do you have any idea what this means?" He nodded once. "Yes. It means we raised one daughter who lived honestly and another who didn't." She stared at him, speechless. He turned to me then, and his expression softened. "Emily," he said, "I should have stood up for you a long time ago. I'm sorry." I studied him for a moment. The man who had always chosen silence, who had always watched from the sidelines. "You don't have to apologize," I said quietly. "Just don't stay silent anymore." Something in his eyes shifted like a weight finally lifting. A gust of wind swept through scattering petals from the abandoned floral archway across the pavement. The sound of laughter drifted faintly from the far end of the estate, where the last of the guests were leaving. My phone buzzed. An email notification slid across the screen. I opened it. From Charles Wellington. Subject Partnership Confirmation Body. Ms. Carter. Thank you for your transparency. Wellington Group remains fully committed to Greenforge. Integrity deserves to be rewarded. CW. I handed the phone to Sarah. She read it, smiled faintly. "Well, that answers that. Integrity clause works both ways," I said. She nodded. "Guess so." A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. News alerts this time. Madison Carter, under investigation for academic fraud. I didn't need to ask who filed it. Henry was nothing if not thorough. Linda had sunk onto a nearby bench, scrolling through her own phone. Her hands were shaking. On the screen, headlines rolled endlessly. Bride exposed for fake credentials. Family faces backlash. Wellington Group responds to scandal. Each new alert hit her like a blow. "They're tearing her apart," she whispered. "My baby." Robert put a hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away, but she didn't look at him either. Sarah glanced at me uncertain. "Do we stay?" I shook my head. "No, there's nothing left here." We turned toward the car. Behind us, Linda's voice followed, small and broken. "Emily, please fix this." I didn't answer. Some things weren't meant to be fixed. As we reached the edge of the lot, I paused, looking back at the estate. Its walls gleaming under the floodlights, the words, "Wellington X Green Forge," still visible on the entrance plaque. The irony of it almost made me laugh. Justice doesn't need directions. It always finds the right address. Sarah unlocked the car, but I stayed a moment longer, staring out across the lake. The city lights shimmered on the surface like scattered fire. For the first time in a long while, I felt the quiet weight of peace. Not triumph, not revenge, just balance restored. I slipped into the passenger seat. Sarah started the engine. As we drove away, the estate disappeared behind a curve of trees, swallowed by the dark. The night was still cold, but it felt cleaner somehow, emptied of pretense, washed in truth. And somewhere out there, karma was still working steady as the tide finishing what I'd started without ever saying a word. 3 months later, Seattle had settled back into its rhythm. Gray skies, coffee lines, the soft hum of a city that never stopped rebuilding itself. From the 20th floor of Green Forge headquarters, I could see the harbor glinting in the morning light, cranes rising like steel giants against the skyline. The press conference had gone better than expected. The city had just signed a $50 million sustainability contract with us to retrofit municipal buildings with our carbon-neutral materials. The cameras flashed as the mayor shook my hand, the city's seal gleaming on the wall behind us. A reporter from the Seattle Journal raised her hand. "Ms. Carter, how does it feel to move past the Wellington incident?" There's still a lot of chatter about what happened that day. I smiled steady. Green Forge doesn't focus on the past, I said. We just keep doing what we believe is right. Another reporter called out, "So you don't see that event as a setback?" "Setbacks only happen when you stop," I said. "We didn't—" The room chuckled softly. Cameras flashed again and someone shouted, "One last photo." I obliged, holding the signed contract, as the bulbs strobed white. When it was over, I stepped off the stage, shaking hands with officials, investors. People who now greeted me with respect, they once reserved for men, twice my age. The crowd thinned until only a few reporters remained packing up their gear. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard a voice I hadn't expected. Impressive, it said. I turned. My father stood there, thinner than I remembered, his suit hanging looser at the shoulders. There were faint lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Dad." I said, a mix of surprise and warmth catching in my chest. "You came." He nodded, smiling awkwardly. "I read about the contract in the paper. Thought I'd see it for myself." "Well, now you have," I said lightly. He looked around the bright glass-walled conference room, then back at me. "I used to think reputation made a person valuable," he said, voice softer now. "Turns out it's the other way around. It's value that builds reputation." I couldn't help but smile. "You learned that faster than Mom ever did." He chuckled, the sound carrying a weight of regret. "Your mother's getting help. She's at a recovery program working with a counselor. It's been rough, but she's trying." I nodded. "That's good." "She still asks about you," he said. "Every week. Does she?" "She does. She says she's sorry. For everything." I took a breath, steady. I believe her. But some apologies aren't meant to fix things. They're just meant to be heard. He nodded again. "I think she knows that." We stood there for a while, neither of us talking. The quiet filled only by the city's noise outside. Before he left, he reached into his pocket and handed me a small envelope. "Old habits die hard," he said, half smiling. "Your mother wanted me to give you this." Inside was a simple note, handwritten in her cursive. "You were right about everything. Love, Mom." I folded it carefully, slid it into my planner, without comment. After he left, I walked through the glass hallway to my office. The space smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, the way it always did. Sarah was waiting by my desk, tablet in hand. "Ready for the site visit?" she asked. "Let's go," I said. We drove out toward Lake Washington, the city gradually giving way to open fields, and the wide sweep of the newly completed Wellington Eco Park. The gates were open now, the construction long finished. The lake shimmered in the distance, the estate framed by the clean geometry of our design. Hard to believe it's the same place, Sarah said, as we walked through the entrance. It's exactly the same, I said. The difference is how we see it now. Tourists were already milling around, taking photos by the solar-lit paths. The plaque near the main courtyard caught the sunlight, its engraving sharp and bright, built with integrity. By Greenforge Industries. We stopped in front of it. I reached out, brushing my fingers across the cool metal. For a moment, all the noise faded. The wind, the chatter, the faint sounds of the lake. And it was just me and the words. Sarah watched me quietly. Feels good, doesn't it? I nodded. It does. But not for the reason people think. What reason, then? Because it's proof that what's real doesn't need defending. She smiled. You always have the best quotes. We kept walking along the edge of the property. From here, the whole project stretched out like a living thing, solar roofs glinting under the sun-water channels, feeding the gardens. The hum of renewable energy quietly powering everything. It was beautiful, and for the first time, it felt finished. Later that afternoon, as we drove back toward Seattle, I glanced at the city skyline glowing ahead of us. Somewhere out there, my mother was learning how to rebuild herself, my sister was starting over, and my father had finally learned to speak out loud. Karma doesn't punish to destroy. It teaches how to begin again. I looked out at the road, at the sun sinking low over the sound and thought. Not of revenge, not even of justice, but of peace. And peace, I realized, was the truest victory of all. A year later, the city felt different. Lighter, somehow, as if the fog that had hung over Seattle for so long had finally lifted. The night of the Women in Sustainability Awards was clear and warm, the streets glittering with rain that had fallen earlier, now reflecting the glow of streetlights and window displays. The convention center buzzed with energy. People in evening gowns and tailored suits mingled in the lobby wine glasses in hand programs folded neatly against their palms. The air smelled faintly of lilies and fresh ink. I stood just off stage, the host's voice echoing through the ballroom. And our final honoree tonight is someone who turned the very thing she was once judged for into a cornerstone of innovation and integrity. Please welcome the CEO of Greenforge Industries, Emily Carter. The applause rose like a wave. I stepped onto the stage, the bright lights washing over me. For a heartbeat, the room disappeared, and all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my heels against the polished floor. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and let the sound of the crowd settle into quiet. For a moment, I didn't speak. I just looked out across the sea of faces, and then my voice, steady but full, carried through the room. A few years ago, I was told not to show up to a family event. I was told my job, my hands-on, dirt-under-the-nails kind of work, was embarrassing, that it didn't belong in the same room as people who wore perfection like armor. A faint murmur rippled through the crowd. I listened. I said, smiling softly, and for a while I stayed quiet. But silence has a funny way of teaching you who you are, because the same work they were ashamed of, the same job they said made me unfit for their table, is the work that built what stands here today. The applause started softly, then grew. I was once banned from a wedding for being too real, but that same reality became the thing no one could deny. I continued. Greenforge started in a garage with a single machine and a handful of people who believed that honest work could change the world. And maybe it can't fix everything, but it can build something that lasts. My eyes swept the front row. Sarah sat beside Henry, both smiling proudly. She gave me a small thumbs up that made me laugh under my breath. In the back, I caught sight of my father. Robert, older but calmer, a quiet strength in his eyes. When he noticed me looking, he nodded once. That small gesture said more than any apology ever could. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about realizing you no longer need them to understand. The applause faded again, and I finished simply. To every woman who's ever been told her work wasn't good enough, her dreams too small, or her hands too rough, This award belongs to you. Keep building." The lights dimmed as the host returned, thanking the sponsors, the applause echoing one last time before fading into the murmur of conversation. Later in the press room, reporters circled microphones angled forward. One of them, a young woman with a notebook trembling slightly in her hand, asked Ms. Carter, "If you could go back, change anything about what happened that year, would you?" I looked at her, smiling gently. "No," I said, "I wouldn't change a thing. I'd still stay quiet when they told me I wasn't welcome. Because sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the sound truth makes before it's heard." She lowered her pen slowly, thoughtful. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the faint hum of the city through the glass walls of the building. The skyline shimmered in gold and silver reflections. Steel glass and light. I walked out to the terrace away from the noise. From up here, the whole city stretched out like a heartbeat. Alive, imperfect, and beautiful. I rested my hands on the railing, feeling the wind lift my hair from my shoulders. The best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's building something so real they can't deny it. The lights from the water below flickered like tiny fires. Somewhere out there, Madison was starting over. Mom was healing, and Dad was learning to live without silence. Maybe that was enough. And me, I'd finally stopped needing their approval. Because everything I'd ever wanted to say was already written, in glass, in steel, in the foundations of a company built on truth. I turned to leave one last glance at the skyline before stepping back inside. If you've ever been looked down on for the path you chose, remember this. Your worth doesn't need an invitation to be seen. And with that, I smiled, letting the doors close behind me as the city lights reflected across the glass, brighter than they'd ever been.